Hey YouTube, I'm Tony Masilis. I'm a producer here at the CBS Evening News, and I have the pleasure of working with Katie Couric on a very regular basis.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure. And you're obviously known for your interview skills. So there's this new channel at YouTube called the Reporter Center, and they wanted us to just ask you a few questions about what makes a good interview.
Okay.
So maybe the first question would be, what makes somebody a good interviewer?
Well, I think it's really important, Tony, to be a gracious host, because I think the more comfortable you make someone feel, the better interview you'll ultimately get. So I know that in terms of body language, I always try to be very warm and welcoming, and I think it's really critical to put someone at ease. I think also you have to calibrate your tone depending on what interview you're doing. If I'm talking to David Duke about, anti-Semitism or racism, obviously I'll have a very different tone. I'll be much more pugnacious than I would be when I'm talking to someone who may have suffered a personal tragedy. So I think it's really important to be very empathetic in some cases, and then to know when you're going to be loaded for bear and really try to elicit important information from someone who may be a bit oily and not direct in answering your questions.
How do you prepare for an interview?
Well, I try to do a combination of explaining what I can in the body of the question without going on and on. And I try to ask questions, obviously, that don't require a yes or no answer, because that's a disaster, because you're left kind of with a lot of dead air. And depending on who I'm talking to, I fashion my questions that way. And I sometimes go through them and think, well, how is this person likely to answer this? And what would be an appropriate follow-up? And knowing what they've said in previous interviews or their positions on various issues, I think, well, how can I go at this another way? Sometimes it happens spontaneously, obviously, when someone doesn't answer your questions. But at other times, I think you can predict appropriate follow-up questions.
It might sound a little bit Captain Obvious, but listening is probably really important, right?
Very, very. Nothing is worse for me than as a viewer to watch someone go down a laundry list of questions and not explore something with a little more depth after someone has answered a question already. To not pick up on something, maybe an inconsistency or something that may be news, and follow up on that and use that as a springboard to go into a whole different area. I think you need to use your questions as sort of a template, but you have to be willing to listen, as you said, Tony, and really veer off in a totally different direction. I can't stand it when people don't have the ability to do that. I'm like, it makes me crazy.
Now, that being said, have you ever had an interview go pretty far south on you where you're sitting there like, what do I do now?
Yeah, well, it is hard. Sometimes people freeze. Sometimes they're just cranky. I had an actor who I interviewed, who shall remain nameless, who just didn't want to be bothered. It really annoyed me because I was giving him a lot of time on national television and he clearly didn't want to be there. But one member of the Flying Wallendas, I know, why was I interviewing them? This woman answered every question with a monosyllabic answer, and it was very frustrating to kind of get her to elaborate. And then Bobcat Goldthwait, the comedian, I sort of missed the memo that he screamed, so I kept asking him, why are you yelling at me? And I didn't realize, stupidly, that was part of his shtick.
Did you know who he was?
Really embarrassing. I kind of knew a little bit about who he was. Now I certainly know all about him.
Oh, well, I'm sure you do. The hard way, right?
Yeah,
you
exactly.
learned about Bobcat.
Exactly.
Any last-minute tips that you want to give to people? Anything that anybody starting out in the business might want to know?
Well, I think you should remember who you're serving, your audience. You're trying to inform them. You're trying to illuminate a certain subject, enlighten people. And I think you need to keep that in mind. This isn't a self-aggrandizing exercise about how much you know. It's not an opportunity for a gotcha moment. I think it's really to shed some light on how someone thinks and their position, and to allow them to communicate. And I think if you allow your interview subject to communicate whatever message he or she might have at that moment, then you've done an effective job.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's time for me to get back to the other side of the camera where I belong.
I like you here, Tony.
Oh, well, hey, it feels pretty comfortable being in this light.
Why
anyway,
don't we switch places?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But be sure to check out Katie's YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Katie Couric. Thanks for watching.